It's the beginning of a new month, and that can only mean one thing. It is time for your piping hot monthly Bitcoin digest, and there is some big news to cover. So let's jump in. Welcome back to another video. My name is Ian Major. I'm an entrepreneur, Bitcoin pleb, and all-around raging capitalist. And of course, there are some truly massive news to cover. Today, we will be primarily revolving around the Ukraine and Russia conflict and the implications for not just Bitcoin, but indeed the sort of broader petrodollar system. So we'll talk through some of that as well as some other news, so you won't want to miss a thing. For those returning to the channel, welcome back, my friends. As always, it is a pleasure to have you. And for those new to the channel, I welcome you as well. Over 80% of you watching right this very moment are not currently subscribed. So if you like this content, I invite you to consider subscribing and join us in our merry, growing gang in cyberspace. I cover all manner of Bitcoin-related content, including news and analysis like this, but also a whole slew of tutorials around wallets, securing your Bitcoin, acquiring Bitcoin, running a node, mining, and more. So without further ado, let's jump into the meat for today. So it's 2022, and what would it be without reading some strategic insight from a headless fish? But I think this is a really fascinating take, and perhaps one of the more insightful that I don't think a lot of people are fully kind of processing and digesting. So I'm just going to straight up go through and read you this thread. So this individual says, Putin didn't just invade the Ukraine on 2/24/22. He officially ended the petrodollar system. Now, if this is a totally foreign concept, this is essentially the de facto monetary system in which we have lived. In 1971, you had the severing of the link between the dollar and gold. And really 1974 onward is kind of the petrodollar scheme. Lynn Alden has a very, very good, in fact, a number of great pieces on the petrodollar system. It is essentially the system in which energy pricing is done in dollars. And so the vast majority of energy trade is done in dollars. The sort of handshake there is the US will protect for example, Saudi's oil to get to their various shipment locations. And in exchange, the Saudis will price oil in dollars. And this serves as a constant source of demand for dollars, which is why the dollar is typically stronger versus other currencies. That's a very, very simplistic rundown of it. I've done a whole video on some of the nuances there that I encourage you to check out. But nonetheless, talking about a very, very big deal, right? This has been the dominant system for, essentially 50 years now. And so this individual asks how. Remember, Russians don't do anything without a plan. They and China have been prepping for this moment for years and are now ready. And this is a pretty extraordinary chart. This is looking at China-Russia trade settlement. And so it basically tracks from 2015 when 90% of that trade was conducted in dollars. And that's come all the way down to less than 50% in Q1 2020. And I'm sure that's only gone down since. So Russia and China have been working on this for some time to reduce their reliance on the dollar, which can and has been weaponized against enemies of the United States. And so this individual goes on to say, Russia has stated NATO expansion into Ukraine was a red line. They knew their invasion of Ukraine would be inevitable and would have strategized that the US/West's response would be swift payment system exclusions and sanctions which started today. So I think a lot of people have learned about SWIFT over the last few days, right? SWIFT is technically a messaging system, communication of information that supports cross-border international kind of trade payments and settlements. Reasonable to expect that Russia's next step will be to shut off oil and gas pipelines to Europe, as Russia has built up huge yuan, gold, and commodity reserves. This is very true. They've been a huge buyer of gold over the last few years. This will cause massive price and supply disruptions, think war level, to the Western markets and monetary system. That is also true if that in fact happens. For years, Russia and China have looked for ways to remonetize gold and exit abuses of the SWIFT system as a geopolitical tool against them. But how to do it? How to exit without the West declaring it an act of aggression or war against the West? Well, this Ukraine invasion just accomplished that end, and the West is doing it themselves. Now, free to declare themselves SWIFT system outcasts by the Western government hands, Russia can now say, we will turn oil pipelines back on, but not for dollars. Their leverage as an oil producer, so the third largest in the world, will cause almost immediate price shocks to the Western world. A good part of the population could immediately be unable to heat their homes. Make no mistake, I've got a good buddy who works in energy pricing here in the US, and so he sees things before consumers will, and indeed we're already seeing upward pressure on gas prices. Almost equal to the oil shock they'd cause is their ability, though not as immediate, to cause food shortages and price spikes through the disruption of wheat production. So a quarter of the world's wheat supply is actually produced in Russia and Ukraine. Unmentioned in all of this is China, who has been silent and not condemned Russia. This means silent approval and cooperation. What was interesting is that subsequent to this, China did come out and they stopped financing certain deals, I believe, with some of the Russian banks. Who knows if that's just sort of psyops. But in any case, China will act to soak up Russian production of oil and wheat to soften the blow to their strategic partner. This will again be through the yuan ruble facility and at some point overtly stated gold backing of that system by Russia and China. Both of them have, big gold reserves. The West will, of course, declare those last two bullets as acts of global aggression and direct threats to the, quote, world monetary system. That is true. That doesn't necessarily mean that, Russia and China are going to try and go back to a gold standard. But what this is basically saying is that they have the reserves of gold and even to some extent, foreign reserves to essentially do what is next, number 10 here. It's at this point that there will be a clear fracture of the world's monetary systems into two competing East-West structures, circling back to the initial point that the 50-year global petrodollar system has just officially been ended. At some point in all this, China aims on Taiwan will come into play, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this could be a little bit alarmist. A lot of the comments sort of point out that, look, yeah, Russia is the third biggest energy producer, but beyond that, its economy isn't that influential on the global scale. But you have to think about not just the total size of the economy, but specifically the products that the economy is selling. And when it comes to Russia, energy is fundamental. It is foundational to all of human civilization. Everything ultimately comes back to energy and the price of energy. And so make no mistake, there is a lot of leverage here. And I also furthermore think it's a little bit ridiculous to think that, Putin and Russia hadn't kind of thought through these knock-on effects and planned for them accordingly. So it's a very, very interesting take. But we should be reminded, right, that this hasn't yet played out. The sanctions that have been slapped on thus far are largely, they're partial in nature. They're definitely going to cause some pain to Russia, and indeed we've seen that in the fact that the ruble has tumbled 25% versus the dollar. But keep in mind, as Luke Grauman reminds us, while the Russian people may get hurt by the falling ruble, the real sort of currency for Russia is energy. And that is actually going up versus the dollar, right? Oil is becoming more expensive, priced in whatever fiat you name. The sanctions, at least as of now, as far as I'm aware, still have a carve out for energy. So they haven't sort of, they're imposing restrictions and sanctions, but they're saying, well, energy pricing is still fine because Western nations, in particular Europe, know that they would be in a lot of trouble if Russia were to cut off oil and gas in response to a sort of full-blown SWIFT system sanction. So that has not yet happened, but what that thread illustrated is what could happen if it does. And so what does that mean for Bitcoin? A lot of folks are postulating, well, to what extent will Russia perhaps use, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to kind of get around sanctions? Not surprisingly, folks like Elizabeth Warren have come out and, made statements such as this: cryptocurrencies risk undermining sanctions against Russia, allowing Putin and his cronies to evade economic pain. Right, so you're going to see a lot of sort of hysterical cries about that. And she gets a fat ratio on this tweet as deserved. But indeed, we've seen as the ruble has plunged, there's been a huge uptick in, I think, Binance activity from kind of Russia and Ukraine. And that coupled with, I think, just the general realization of, no one out there is sort of rooting. Well, there are individuals out there rooting for war, but I think the vast majority of folks are obviously not rooting for war, but are realizing that, through this conflict, some of the properties of Bitcoin, they're kind of running the scenarios in their heads, and they're realizing the value prop, right? Nations and individuals can use Bitcoin for its censorship-resistant properties. And so that, coupled with the uptick in buying from Ukraine, Russia, and others around the world, probably drove some liquidations for short sellers. And so that led to, yesterday when we saw a 15% gain in Bitcoin versus the dollar. And as Dylan very interestingly points out, over the last few days, that's been quite a divergence from the NASDAQ that is showing here with NDX. So very interesting. A lot of people are starting to say, well, is this the decoupling of Bitcoin from the broader kind of risk asset market? I think it's too early to call there, but it is really interesting to say the least, as Dylan says. And what's also interesting is Luke reminds us that Bitcoin really is this kind of last functioning smoke detector that policymakers have been unable to disable. And he points out that, Bitcoin has been a nearly flawless leading indicator of sequential Fed liquidity moves. And so if this crisis continues to escalate, you have to imagine all the Fed's posturing around rate rises and tightening has to go out the window, particularly if pressure is placed on Western economies in the fashion that we were discussing earlier. What's all that mean? I think it's still too early to say, but there is, I think, real pressure, and there is a real scenario in which the petrodollar system, as we've known it for 50 years, really takes a turn that it's not going to kind of come back from. And despite the tragedies inherent in such a crisis, it still is the case that Bitcoin is being seen for its properties such as censorship resistance. And so it is interesting. I think we'll have to wait and see. But make no mistake, this is a big deal. I mean, these are huge sort of earthquakes happening geopolitically. And so I'll be definitely watching this very closely and likely doing follow-up videos on this as we go forth in the next couple of weeks. Just to rattle off a few other bits of news, you saw eBay come out and, with rumors that they'll accept Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies as payment. Keep in mind, they've been saying that for a long time now. I think there was an article I found back in May of 2021. So again, not everything is as bullish or as bearish as you think. Whenever you see a piece of news, there's usually some deeper story. You also had Europe, which had been posturing about banning what seemed to be Bitcoin. That provision has actually been taken out of some of their latest crypto legislation. And so the sort of phrasing that the provision that was taken out is the following: as from Jan 1, 2025, crypto assets issued, offered, or admitted to trading in the union shall not be based on or rely on, quote, environmentally unsustainable consensus mechanisms. The consensus mechanisms shall comply with minimum environmental sustainability standards. So absolutely just laughable on so many levels. And they got a ton of pushback on that, and rightly so. And so that provision has been scrapped. It still needs to be voted on. But that's interesting and notable as well. And just again goes to show you this geopolitical game theory is vicious. It is absolutely vicious. And it will be unforgiving for countries, who attempt to ban it. That's just the way it is. And then lastly, as part of this roundup, Wasabi 2.0 testnet is officially live. This is very exciting. We've been waiting for Wasabi 2.0 for a very, very long time. But hopefully that's a good thing. Hopefully the team has been really thoughtful about building a really great product. And so I will definitely be playing around with this. Whether I do a video on it now while it's in testnet versus waiting for mainnet remains to be seen. But be on the lookout for some very exciting stuff with Wasabi 2.0. So again, if you're not currently subscribed, hit that subscribe button, hit the like button as well, because you're not going to want to miss that. With all of that, my friends, let's go ahead and conclude this video. All right, so we took a look today primarily at just some very interesting developments coming out of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Obviously, it's tragic what's happening But the sort of through lines that we've focused on in today are really the implications economically from a kind of macro perspective. We took a look at a plausible scenario for how the petrodollar system as a whole could start to really come apart in a meaningful way, and that is massively significant. It's significant for Bitcoin in its own right, but we've also seen Bitcoin be impacted by Russians and Ukrainians buying Bitcoin, realizing the ruble is plunging in value. And I think for better or worse, it's been a demonstration to the world of what it means to be uncensorable money. But I'm curious to hear what you think. Again, a lot of this is still yet to be written. What are your thoughts? What do you think we're going to see next? Leave me a comment down below with your thoughts. But for now, my friends, we'll go ahead and leave this here. I hope you found this valuable and useful. If you did, you already know what to do. Smash that like button. But for now, we'll go ahead and end this video. As a reminder, my friends, in times like these, especially, every sat counts. And until next time, I'll see you then.